Hello everybody and welcome to Grey History, episode 82, The Trial of the Girondins Part 1. With political trials having commenced in earnest, it was now the turn of the Gironde. But, despite the hostility of the ultra-radicals, the fate of the Girondins was by no means clear-cut. From early efforts for amnesty to additional purges of the Convention, the story of this trial differs considerably to that of the former Queen. So, with an ever-growing conspiracy and attempts to send more than 100 to the guillotine, buckle up because things are about to get messy. Yet, before we get into it, I need your help. Grey History is only possible thanks to the support of listeners, and I need your support to keep this podcast on the air. With ad-free listening, bonus content, and a range of other perks, you can enjoy all these benefits and help make history that isn't black and white. So please, for the price of a cup of coffee, you can ensure that there's more Grey History waiting for you tomorrow. Just follow the links in the show notes on the website or Google Grey History Patreon. Of course, it's with great pleasure that I get to welcome the newest members of the Grey History community. A warm welcome to the newest virtuous citizens, Lizzie, Oksana, Susan, Liam, Maria, Shane, Kelly, Ray and Baird. Another warm welcome to the newest true revolutionaries, Griff and Mark. As we know, the people need their champions, and their latest defender is Gordon. Gordon joins the amazing champions of the people, Cindy, George, William, Laura, Daniel, Monica, Joel, Adam, Tom, Eyal, Harold, David, Alistair, Jeff, Regis, Cameron, Britt, Dan, Paul, Deborah, Susan and Danny. Finally, one last thank you to the great of the greats, the pantheon of heroes, the fabulous Brian, Charles, Jeff, Auger, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Ron, Kevin S. and Fernando. Thank you so much to every member of the community, and thank you again to everyone who is sharing the show with friends and family, leaving one-off donations, or helping the podcast in any other way. After days of lengthy proceedings, the jury had reached its verdict. Guilty on all charges. For the exhausted defendants, the news was no surprise. Tried collectively, they reacted individually. Brissot, the most iconic of the Girondins, dropped his arms and his head, bowing to his irreversible defeat. Carrard looked unmoved, while Vernieu sat boldly, with prideful disdain. The brothers Fonfred and Ducos embraced one another, while Abbé Fouché appeared to pray. Le Source quoted the ancients, while Sillery, a Montagnard accused alongside his foes, was bold enough to declare that this was the most glorious day of his life. Yet, if many were courageous in their final hours, Boileau was not. The Judas of the accused, Boileau had betrayed his peers in an attempt to save himself. Realizing that his confession of conspiracy was insufficient, he shouted, "I am innocent." The others followed suit. "We are innocent," were the cries of almost 24 condemned. "We are innocent." But were they innocent? And if guilty, what precisely were the crimes? That is for us to discover in this most controversial chapter. In order to examine the trial of the Girondins in October 1793, one must rewind the clock to the fateful moment when the deputies lost their power. On the 2nd of June, the leaders of the right side of the chamber were purged from the National Convention. Officially, 29 deputies were placed under house arrest, and the demise of the so-called 22 was a major victory for Parisian radicals. Yet, when the dust settled on these insurrectionary events, a new question became immediately apparent. What was to happen next? For the most radical participants of the People's Coup, the trial of the traitors was the obvious progression. With a list of crimes and schemes that rivaled the deposed monarchs, death was clearly the answer. But for all the influence of the Albertists in the months to come, the demands of the city's militants were not yet deafening. In June, Marat was still alive, Danton controlled the Committee of Public Safety, and the Federalist revolts were only just beginning. With inflation and food shortages not yet at their peak, the initiative remained with the Convention's deputies. Of these, one can identify three distinct camps. Firstly, the triumphant Mountain. Secondly, the detained Gironde. And finally, the free Girondins who retained their seats. If we start with the latter, the Girondins still within the Convention were unable to marshal force in the capital itself. As such, these deputies relied on their voice. Decrying the purge of elected representatives, dozens formally protested the proscription of their colleagues. In the weeks that followed, more than 75 deputies signed protests of various descriptions. In letters to their home departments, they also wrote of the crimes and horrors which had consumed a chaotic and lawless capital. Unknowingly, these representatives were authoring their own demise. But if the remaining Girondins largely restrained themselves to acts of vocal protest, some of the detained were willing to fight. Having warned of Jacobin tyranny for months on end, their arrest was perceived as nothing short of a radical Montagnard coup. With the nation now in the hands of despots and anarchists, rebellion was a sacred duty. The flight of the Girondins now occurred. Confined to their homes rather than prison, the leniency of the Convention assisted their escape. Dozens fled to the departments, including leading figures like Brissot, Pétion, and the former minister, Rollin. Their destinations varied significantly. The Norman, Buzot, went north to rally his countrymen, and he was joined by more than a dozen deputies. Settling in Caen, the well-connected port was both close to the capital and the epicentre of the northern insurrections. Others looked elsewhere, with Lyon and Marseille both receiving deputies, while areas around Bordeaux harboured several who later escaped Normandy. Travelling across the country, these fugitives told their tale, sparing sympathy and revolt. Yet it is noteworthy that escape was not the only choice for the detained. Vergniaud and Jessenay both remained behind, choosing to instead trust the process, prove their innocence, and rouse public support through a trial. Such a stance was undoubtedly honourable, but it was also ill-advised. One may even see the same misplaced idealism which got them toppled in the first place. But if it seems foolish to us for turkeys to voluntarily remain in the oven, that's because our perceptions are tainted by later events. As we discuss the evolution of the proceedings against the Girondins, I want you to keep one thing in mind. Historians disagree as to the likely fate of the detained at the start of June. Some scholars argue that the majority would probably have survived any legal trial. Furthermore, they make the case that most Jacobins wanted to be lenient to their vanquished colleagues. Yes, Brissot was presumably a dead man walking, but prior to the Federalist revolts and Marat's assassination, execution was not guaranteed for every arrested deputy. Unsurprisingly, this view is not shared by all, with many historians suspicious of moderation in the violent political atmosphere of 1793. Nonetheless, my point here is this. While it may seem to us that death was the logical and potentially only endpoint for the detained, some scholars dispute that this was a foregone conclusion. Indeed, in the immediate aftermath of the purge, the evidence is far from conclusive that unprecedented show trials were the intentions of leading Jacobins. Indeed, quite the opposite. It's here that we should turn our attention to the response of the triumphant mountain. On the 6th of June, 4 days after the Girondins' arrest, the Deputy Barrère rose to deliver a report from the Committee of Public Safety. Like Danton, Barrère was a current member of the committee, and both had worked to stifle the insurrectionists in late May. Unable to prevent the purge of their colleagues, the moderate inclination of what was still Danton's committee was far from extinguished. Having dug up Barrère's speech from the French archives, what I found was something altogether unexpected. Required by political realities to legitimise the actions of the people, Barrère was nonetheless critical of the events of 2 June, warning that tumults and excesses only served the Republic's enemies. He delivered a stark message to his peers. Revolutionary institutions were overstepping their authority. Unrest was being used to further the plans of reaction. The deputies themselves were behaving like gladiators rather than wise legislators. This was simply untenable. Lamenting the current state of affairs, Barrère did not blame his Girondin colleagues for every sin imaginable. Instead, he called for the resumption of good government, the rejection of parties, and a singular focus on the improvement of laws and the perfection of public order. Although not without his criticisms of recent Girondin actions, Barrère was the very definition of restrained. Consequently, he did not announce a trial, nor even an indictment. Instead, Danton's Committee of Public Safety proposed something far more radical: the exchange of hostages. With Girondins detained in the capital, it was proposed that Montagnard deputies be sent to the departments as a means to secure the peace. Ultimately, this measure was defeated, opposed vigorously by many Jacobins, including Robespierre. But the idea of swapping hostages does demonstrate, at least for some historians, that political show trials were not actively planned when the Girondins were first detained. So, on the 6th of June, Danton's Committee of Public Safety was prepared to strike a more conciliatory tone. Appreciating that the arrest of elected deputies naturally alarmed the departments, the victorious Jacobins hoped that moderation was the path to averting civil war. Interestingly, in Barrère's speech, even Lyon, which had already undergone its anti-Jacobin municipal revolution, was acknowledged to be controlled by victors who proclaimed their love of liberty. Considering it was Barrère who would later propose the demolition of Lyon and renaming it Liberated City, such praise is not without its irony. Yet, with the Federalist revolts only beginning to take shape, insurrection had not yet poisoned the goodwill of the National Convention. Likewise, the Girondin fugitives were not yet the authors of an indefensible civil war or the opponents of the exalted Constitution. But between Barrère's report on the 6th of June and Saint-Just's next report on the 8th of July, the stance of the committee had changed. Although still Danton's committee, the interim had seen the widespread eruption of revolt, with several large cities veering from mere protests to outright rebellion. Leagues were being formed, armies were being raised, representatives on mission were even being detained. Now, the fugitive Girondins were leading the Federalist struggle, an act against the very foundations of the one and indivisible Republic. With foreign powers advancing and a constitution proclaimed, the refusal to accept the convention's authority was increasingly intolerable. Consequently, the attitudes of deputies were hardening, including the independence of the plain. Come the second week of July, when Saint-Just presented the committee's latest report, the tone of moderation was noticeably less so. On the 8th of July, 1793, Saint-Just dropped the C word: conspiracy. In a lengthy speech, the Girondins were portrayed as the authors of a grand and sinister plot. Even before the convention had assembled in September the year prior, these false patriots had advanced the royalist cause. The evidence for these charges was overwhelming. Firstly, in August 1792, the Girondins of the then Legislative Assembly had shielded the monarchy on the very day of the throne's demise. Judged by the sovereign nation, the Girondins had suspended the king, rather than immediately dethrone him. This legal trickery was just the first of many such tactics designed to bolster the forces of reaction. From the appeal to the people, to efforts for exile and clemency, the Girondins had spoken of liberty, but betrayed it at every turn. With the king dead, the conspirators changed tack. According to Saint-Just, the Girondins had worked with Dumouriez to enthrone Louis's cousin, the former Duc d'Orléans. The fact that the self-styled Philippe Égalité had been a firm Montagnard deputy and had been arrested in April due to Girondin attacks was dismissed as mere conspiratorial facades. The impeachment of Marat, the Commission of 12, the Federalist revolts, the rejection of the new constitution, all of these were just the latest efforts to doom the virtuous republic. The guilt of these monarchical agents was clearly beyond doubt. Yet, even now, having unmasked this grand conspiracy, Danton's Committee of Public Safety was attempting a moderate position. Far from demanding the trial of all the detained, Saint-Just carefully categorised them into three distinct groups: the traitors, the suspects, and the misled. The traitors were those whose guilt was self-evident. Having fled to the departments and roused the Federalist revolts, their promotion of civil war was simply unforgivable. Charged with preventing the establishment of the Republic and attempting to re-establish the monarchy, 9 men were identified as traitors. Henceforth, they could expect a traitor's death. But the 2nd of June had seen 29 deputies prescribed, along with current and former ministers. If less than a dozen were to be considered traitors, what was to be done with the rest? Well, Saint-Just proposed a further 5 be declared suspects, considered complicit in the crimes of others. Notably, this included Vergniaud and Jessonet, both of whom had refused to flee the capital. Yet, even with these additions, most detainees were neither traitors nor suspects. For these, Saint-Just suggested, get ready for it, amnesty. Insisting that these deputies were deceived rather than guilty, he argued that these prisoners should be both released and recalled. To be clear, Saint-Just was proposing the exoneration and reinstatement of the majority of deputies detained on 2 June. This may seem surprising, but it reflects the political realities of the time. Danton's committee was still attempting a middle course. The incitement of civil war required punishment for the traitors, but condemning every detainee was simply unpalatable. As one contemporary wrote, the trial of so many Girondins would open the door to further quarrel and disorder. This is precisely what the committee was trying to avoid. By targeting only those who were evidently guilty, historian Michael Sydenham asserts that the amnesty has the appearance of an attempt to satisfy both sides and to justify some severity without exciting further controversy by harshness. Given that the convention was still trying to contain and diffuse the Federalist rebellions, such an approach was not without merit. Yet, unfortunately for the majority of the Girondin detainees, the Committee of Public Safety was overruled, with the Jacobins focused on internal struggles surrounding the renewal of the Committee of Public Safety. Moderation was not in vogue. Worse still, the next week changed everything. Firstly, the committee was replaced with a more inflexible body on the 10th of July. Secondly, 3 days later, Marat was murdered in a bathtub. With the moderate Dantonists out of power and the capital consumed by fear and anger, hostility towards the Girondins escalated with unprecedented speed. We heard in episode 75 how Marat's murder discredited the Girondins, and I cannot stress enough that Corday's actions condemned their rank and file. For months, the Girondins had warned of Jacobin conspiracies to murder innocent deputies. Now it was self-evident that the Girondins were the true and present threat. With the deputies of the convention in fear for their lives, the radical Billaud-Varenne took the initiative. Although he would not join the Committee of Public Safety until September, the staunch Montagnard was already an influential figure, particularly in the factional feuds of the convention. On the 15th of July, just 2 days after Marat's death, and a week since Saint-Just recommended amnesty, Billaud-Varenne delivered what historian Timothy Tackett describes as an extraordinary 2-hour tirade. From the position of the tribune, the deputy redefined the debate. Clearly, the Girondins were guilty, every last one of them. As such, they should all be brought to trial. But, even more importantly, Billaud-Varenne proceeded to shape how such trial should proceed. As the Girondins had engaged in numerous conspiracies, Billaud-Varenne rejected the need for firm and conclusive evidence. After all, any good conspiracy would leave no evidence. Consequently, in the absence of hard proof, a moral judgment was sufficient. If one was convinced that the Girondins were guilty, that was enough to convict. This repudiation of evidence in favour of mere gut feeling is a critical development, although by no means new. Keep in mind that the Girondins had attacked their political opponents on the belief that their patriotism was a mask for corruption and conspiracy. Indeed, as historian Maurice Linton notes, the Girondins pioneered these tactics against royal ministers in their rise to power. Back then, allegations could kill careers. Now, they could simply kill. Yet, in the wake of Marat's assassination, the convention did not agree with Billaud-Varenne. Not all the Girondins were evidently guilty, and thus not all would be brought to trial. But if the deputies rejected the totality of Billaud-Varenne's proposal, they also rebuked the leniency of Saint-Just's. By the time the convention turned its attention to formally declaring traitors and suspects, the list of the accused had ballooned significantly. On the 8th of July, Saint-Just had proposed just 9 traitors and 5 suspects. On the 28th, the convention formally decreed 18 traitors and 11 suspects, double the initial proposal, and in addition to individual prescriptions which had occurred throughout recent weeks. Needless to say, the idea that any misled deputies would be released and reinstated was now absolutely unthinkable. So, by the end of July, there were now more than 29 deputies who had been declared traitors or suspects. Adding those who had been individually charged or detained without formal accusations, the list of the proscribed Girondins was already more than 40. Despite this, trials did not begin. Instead, as July turned to August, the convention had bigger problems. The siege of Lyon was only just commencing, while war with the First Coalition was going from bad to worse. With setbacks at home and abroad, the fate of the Girondins was not a primary concern. Well, at least for the convention. With the matter stalled in official channels, the Jacobin Club decided to do the job itself. In developments which I'm sure will surprise absolutely nobody, the Albertists took the lead. Pursuing no shortage of radical policies, the ultra-revolutionaries were initially focused on the purge of aristocratic officers. But, with the execution of General Custine in late August, the season of political trials had begun. Furthermore, a mere 5 days later, Toulon fell to the enemy, and the Committee of Public Safety was thus forced to promise the blood of the Bressots and the Marie Antoinettes. After the tumultuous days of 4 and 5 September, Albertist sympathisers now sat on the committee, while like-minded associates dominated the Paris Commune and held sway in the Jacobin society. As such, the club soon launched investigations of the accused deputies. By October, the findings were damning. Recommending 16 charges against Bressot alone, the allegations of the society were considerable. Hebert personally made sure to implicate others in Bressot's crimes, although the club itself was divided on how best to proceed against lesser conspirators. But these debates proved irrelevant. While the actions of a mere political society had no legal standing, the radicals' persistence had real implications, with the Albertists shaping so much of the capital's politics during the first weeks of the Terror. The convention was forced into action. Formal proceedings ramped up dramatically on the 3rd of October. The day after the Jacobin Club's investigation delivered its initial recommendations against Bressot, the deputy Aymar laid out an official report on behalf of the Committee of General Security. In it, the treasonous Girondin plot was even larger than previously thought, revealing a grand conspiracy to destroy the unity of the Republic. Aymar held nothing back. From the Prussian invasion of 1792 to the Federalist revolts, which still spilt blood in the departments, these false patriots had orchestrated everything. Historian Michael Sydenham summarises the lengthy list of accusations. Like the earlier reports, the indictment reviewed the history of the revolution, in which Aymar professed to find proof of 4 separate plots by the conspirators. The first of these was an attempt to deliver France to the Prussians in the summer of 1792. Discord was to be created by the encouragement of financial speculation and the hoarding of food. Paris was to be discredited and abandoned as the enemy advanced. And finally, the Duke of Brunswick was to be crowned as King of France. The failure of this plan Aymar found in the Prussian defeat at Valmy, after which the evacuation of France by the invaders was arranged by Dumouriez and others. Next came an effort to prevent Louis's execution. The conspirators concealed proofs of the king's duplicity, delayed his trial, attempted to excite unrest by an appeal to the electoral assemblies, and tried to win a reprieve. Frustrated, they attempted to revenge themselves by organising an indiscriminate assassination of Republicans in January and March 1793. A third plan again envisaged the destruction of the Republic by military defeat. The war was deliberately extended and disaster invited by an attempt to invade Spain at the very moment when Dumouriez's desertion and the revolt in the Vendée were anticipated. Finally, the plotters had come into the open, advocating federalism and inciting rebellion throughout France. In all this, Aymar spoke of the conspirators as a united group. He referred to secret meetings in which they concocted their schemes, and asserted that although some charges applied only to individual deputies, that of conspiracy was common to all. If those concerned had occasionally appeared to be divided, that was only deliberate deception. If they had sometimes diverged, they had always reunited to encompass the ruin of France. With a conspiracy even greater than first imagined, so too were the number of perpetrators. At the start of July, Saint-Just had recommended a mere 9 traitors, and 18 were decreed by the end of the month. Come October, Aymar listed 45. For reference, that's more than 5 times the number first proposed by Saint-Just only 3 months prior. Alternatively, that's 5% of the entire National Convention. But, as historian Jeremy Popkin notes, this escalation was fueled by collective responsibility. All prominent Girondins were now being held accountable for anything that any one of them had done. Any letter, any vote, any questionable friendship or association, all individual acts were now components of the larger treasonous plot. Combined with taking actions out of context to create an appearance of guilt, it was easy to identify counter-revolution. Of course, as the number of criminal deputies increased with unprecedented haste, innocents were caught in the middle. Historian Marisa Linton surveys the situation. This was the formal accusation that would be the basis of the legal case brought against the Girondins at their trial. The key charges against the Girondins were that they had tried secretly to save the monarchy, that they had made a catastrophic mess of the war that they themselves had brought into being, and lastly, and most crucially, that they had taken up arms in the Federalist revolt. The charges against the Girondin leaders of recklessness and even criminal incompetence in wartime were serious ones. In the matter of the Federalist revolt, there was a case for saying that the actions of the participants had been treasonous. But the report went further than this. It depicted the Girondins collectively and systematically as conspirators who had always been against the revolution. It also included a number of people who had not evaded the arrest ordered by the convention and had not been party to the Federalist revolt. Aymar stressed their unity. They were all part of the conspiracy. 36 more men were now implicated than in Saint-Just's report. The additional names were those of men who had not been involved in the Federalist revolt and who were only marginally associated with the Girondins' inner network. They were accused of being agents in the service of British Prime Minister Pitt, an altogether more nebulous charge, hard either to prove or to disprove. Aymar listed ways in which Girondin politics corresponded with Pitt's aim to destroy France. The ills of the present war and political disasters were attributed to malevolent machinations by the Girondins, including the declaration of war against leading powers of Europe, the scourge of civil war, the putting in place of treasonous generals at the heads of the armies, the loss of French colonies, and the assassination of Marat and Lepetier. No plausible evidence was offered for these allegations beyond the fact that Pitt would evidently be pleased at France's disastrous situation. So, on the 3rd of October, the list of treasonous deputies doubled. Accused of orchestrating every setback since man was ejected from the Garden of Eden, Aymar sought the trial of all 45 traitors. Yet, as historian Marisa Linton notes, some of the accused were hardly turncoats. Many had tenuous links to the Girondin leadership and had rebuffed the Federalist rebellions. In fact, the deputy Sillery was actually a sincere Jacobin, initially detained because of Girondin accusations. Not that that would save him. Yet, every time I read these events, a shiver runs down my spine. On the 3rd of October, Amar's report was more than a mere formal accusation against deputies already prescribed. Most of the 45 traitors had never been listed in prior decrees. Consequently, traitors still sat in the convention. Before he commenced his report, Amar had asked his peers to forbid the departure of every deputy present. Even the public galleries were barred from leaving, as guards soon blocked the doors. With the nation's assembly now a glorified holding cell, escape was impossible. Accordingly, deputies watched with horror as their names were read aloud. Of the 45 traitors listed, 28 had never been previously accused or arrested. While some were incidentally absent from proceedings or had already fled the capital, many were simply trapped. In vain a few protested, but by now resistance was futile. However, Amar was merely warming up. As the deputy named several traitors who were sitting immediately before him, this was just the beginning. In addition to formally accusing 45 deputies of treason, Amar subsequently listed potential co-conspirators. In the wake of the 2nd of June, more than 75 deputies had signed protests against the insurrection which had forcibly purged their colleagues. By and large, these protests had not been made public, but documents possessing signatures existed nonetheless. Incriminated by their own hand, it was now their turn to be purged. Deemed possible accomplices to the grand Girondin plot, Amar listed almost 6 names who protested the will of the people. While their treason was not yet definitive, their innocence was certainly in doubt. As such, Amar sought their immediate arrest. Of the 75 who signed protests, 65 had not been named in any prior list, meaning that dozens of new deputies were additionally detained. Combined with earlier prescriptions and Amar's 45 traitors, the total number of deputies either arrested or formally accused was now just shy of 130. For reference, that's almost 20% of the entire convention, and that doesn't include former ministers and Girondin allies outside of the assembly. Effectively tripling the number of accused or arrested in just a single speech, scores of deputies were thus taken from their seats. On the 2nd of June, the people had purged the convention. On the 3rd of October, the convention had purged itself. The fate of these new, potential co-conspirators was a matter of immediate debate. Deputies were still barred from leaving the chamber, and so it's perhaps not surprising that words were carefully selected lest new names be added to any list. With opposition effectively silenced, the floor passed to the convention's radicals. A few proposed the arrest of additional deputies, seeing the prescribed immediately grow. Leading the way was the newest member of the Committee of Public Safety, the Jacobin firebrand B.U. Varenne. Having called for the trial of all of the detained Girondins as early as the middle of July, the deputy continued to push the agenda. Firstly, B.U. Varenne demanded the trial of an incredibly prominent colleague, Philippe Égalité. Formerly known as the Duc d'Orléans, the cousin of King Louis XVI had been a Montagnard deputy. Indeed, like the aristocratic Sillery, Philippe Égalité had first been arrested because of Girondin attacks back in April. However, like Sillery, the former Duke was accused of being a fellow conspirator, and thus he required a trial. The convention agreed. Later that same day, Varenne would successfully propose the trial of Queen Marie Antoinette, condemning 2 royals in just a single session. Inspired by Varenne's call to pierce the breast of the enemy, deputies came forward to propose new names. But, even more importantly, some argued that the convention had taken insufficient measures against those who opposed the will of the people. Initially, the Committee of General Security had sought the arrest of 65 deputies who had protested the purging of the Girondins on the 2nd of June. This was to investigate their conduct further, as the committee needed to determine the guilty from the misled. Yet, for the radicals of the convention, this was unacceptable. Clearly, these representatives were allies of the Girondins. Evidently, they were co-conspirators in the vast Girondin plot. As such, they should be declared counter-revolutionaries and join the 45 traitors already scheduled for trial. Formal accusations were now demanded against the dozens of deputies who Amar had only just named and merely sought to detain. This measure would have dramatically escalated proceedings, doubling the list of decreed traitors for the second time in a single day. With the radicals shaping the debate, and opponents literally locked into silence, what was to be done? It was now that Robespierre entered the fray. Prior to the 3rd of October, the prominent Jacobin had taken a hard line against both the detained Girondins and the Federalist revolts. Robespierre had opposed Saint-Just's proposal to release and reinstate the majority of detained deputies back in early July, and since then he had remained inflexible. Joining the Committee of Public Safety at the end of July, his arrival ensured a refusal to negotiate with Federalist Lyon or offer amnesty for other departmental rebels. The convention's supremacy was absolute, and traitors required justice. Yet, in watching proposals to accuse dozens of additional deputies, Robespierre was aghast. Ironically, the influential Jacobin saw the danger of ever larger purges. By declaring another 65 traitors, the convention would weaken its own authority, multiply its foes, and protract the nation's crises. As such, Robespierre intervened. With Paris the domain of the ultra-radicals, such action was not without risks. Here is Robespierre's intervention in full, and you will hear that the incorruptible had to defend himself personally while seeking to protect those deputies who protested against the purge of June 2. The reading proposed by the rapporteur is absolutely useless. By decreeing that the Committee of General Security would make a report to it on the signatories of the protest of June 17, the National Convention has satisfied national justice for the moment. The decree which has just been issued honours the Convention forever, and will pass the name of its members to posterity. It is no longer a tyrant whose natural enemy it was that it struck. It is several of its members who, cowardly perfidious, turned against the people the weapons that it had entrusted to them for its defence. What man is there now who, ready to commit a crime, will not stop, frightened by such an example? What man is there who will doubt that the National Convention devoted itself to the salvation of the fatherland, since it did not even spare its members? The National Convention must not seek to multiply the guilty. It is to the leaders of the faction that it must attach itself. The punishment of the leaders will terrify the traitors and save the country. Most of these great criminals are comprised in the decree of accusation. If there are others among those you have placed under arrest, the Committee of General Security will present you with their nomenclature, and you will always be free to strike them. But, citizens, pay attention that among the men you have seen dragging the chariot of the ambitious men you have unmasked, there are many who have gone astray. No. Robespierre is interrupted by murmurs. I state my opinion in the presence of the people. I say it frankly, and I take them as judge of my intentions. Know, citizens, that you will only be truly defended by those who have the courage to tell the truth, even when circumstances seem to demand their silence. I am far from making an apology for the execrable faction against which I have fought for 3 years, and of which I nearly fell victim several times. My hatred of traitors equals my love for the fatherland, and who will dare to doubt this love? I return to my reasoning, and I say that having ordered the Committee of General Security to make a report on the signatories of the protest, it is your justice to await this report. I say that the dignity of the convention commands it to concern itself only with the leaders, and there are already many among the men whom you have decreed to be indicted. If there are still some, the people are there. They will demand justice from you. I say that among the men placed under arrest, there are many in good faith, but who have been misled by the most hypocritical faction of which history has ever provided an example. I say that among the numerous signatories of the protest, there are several, and I know some, whose signatures have been intercepted. From all these considerations, I ask that the convention leave things as they are until after the report of its committee, and if new culprits are found, it will then be seen whether I will not be the first to call upon their heads the full vengeance of the laws. With the convention backing Robespierre's proposal, dozens of deputies were saved. While some evaded capture, most of these representatives remained in prison throughout the duration of the terror. Yet such luck was hardly universal. 45 traitors were referred to the Revolutionary Tribunal, and for them, justice was swift. 22 deputies were dead within the month. Thank you for listening to episode 82, The Trial of the Girondins Part 1. In the next episode, we'll see the first trials and executions of the convention's own deputies. As always, thank you so much for the support of the community, and between now and the next episode, it would be fantastic if you could recommend the show to at least one other person. Also, if you're enjoying Grey History, you can do your part to help make history that isn't black and white by supporting the show on Patreon. With a 7-day free trial, ad-free listening, and tons of bonus content, there's plenty to enjoy, all while supporting the creation of Grey History. Just follow the links in the show notes on the website or Google Grey History Patreon. One final thank you to all members of the community, and a special thank you again to the amazing heroes of the revolution, Brian, Charles, Jeff, Olga, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Ron, Kevin S., and Fernando. Thank you for listening, stay safe, and have a great day.